All right, everyone. So Google's guidelines are optimizing for generative AI are finally out. And we can see my LinkedIn feed, and I'm pretty sure the same is happening to yours, is blowing up. Everyone is saying the same thing, that AI search optimization is not a thing. Why? Because Google says so, right? You can see, for example, here, Google says, from our perspective, optimizing for generative AI search is optimizing for the search experience and thus still SEO. So AI search optimization is not a thing according to Google. But do you really want to hear what Google has to say on how to optimize for their own platform? Historically, SEOs have been smart enough to know that sometimes Google gives pretty bullshit advice, but at this point, it looks like everyone is just trusting what this big G organization has to say. So I just wanted to go through this and point a couple of things out to you, which are really, really interesting and are totally invisible to the rest of the community. For some reason, no one is talking about this. So of course, at the start, we have a lot of content here, a lot of guidelines. Most of this stuff is pretty high level, and to be honest, it doesn't really mean anything, right? Of course, they talk about how you need to have a unique point of view, create non-commodity content, organize content in a way that helps your readers, blah, blah, blah. But all of this is pretty vague. So if we just go through the section, you can read through it. I'm not sure if you're going to find something concrete. What's actually interesting is this section that goes on myth busting around generative AI search optimization. And the irony is crazy because let's go with the first one, right? So I can see llms.txt file and other special markup. What Google is right now saying is you don't need to create new machine readable files, AI text files, markup or markdown to appear in generative AI search. Makes sense, right? But at the same time, if you see what Google is doing, it's the exact opposite, even for this exact documentation piece. So I saw this post on LinkedIn from Garrett from iPullRank, and this is amazing because the same Google who's telling you why you should not be using markdown files actually have the same guidelines for optimizing for AI search as a markdown file, right? So if I open up this link, you can see the exact screenshot that Garrett also posted. It actually is available on their site as a markdown file geared towards AI search engines. So the irony is huge, right? Google is saying don't use markdown files. Their own guidelines on not using markdown files are available in a markdown file. Isn't it crazy? All right, so coming back to the second one, chunking content. There's no requirement to break your content into tiny pieces for AI to better understand it. Is it really? I would really encourage you to go through this piece on chunking from Michael King, the legendary SEO strategist, who goes over this concept in a lot of detail and talks about how this entire idea of chunking not helping AI search or any search engine in general is just total bullshit. Why? Because it just makes sense. For those of you who don't know what chunking is, it's basically an action that RAG-based systems use. So for example, Claude, ChatGPT, all of these AI models, when they have search as an enabled function in their interface, that they're using to extract content, retrieve content, and then present back to the audience. So instead of looking at the entire piece, they're actually breaking it down by passages. And in fact, it's something that Google also used to do in the form of passage indexing. So if you are saying that AI search actually works like this, they look at your content in chunks, why wouldn't chunking help? It's just good writing with, of course, a caveat of also thinking about cosine similarity. So it's not entirely technical. It's also thinking of human beings. There's a ton of evidence in this article written by Mike King, where he goes over Google's own statements, how they don't make sense, plus referencing actual algorithm patents from Google and from other platforms who use search-driven retrieval systems, and just present a ton of evidence that bite-sized chunks, there's absolutely no way they don't help. It's just a matter of, do you really want to think about cosine similarity for every single piece of paragraph that you write? Maybe not. But to say that it does not help at all is just straight off wrong. All right, so the next one, seeking inauthentic mentions. So what Google is saying is that, of course, we know that brand mentions are now a thing in the age of AI search optimization, but we don't want you to find opportunities manually, pay them or work with them in any sort of value exchange to have your brand mentioned on a bunch of different sites. But if you think about this, it's the same thing that Google said about backlinks, right? This is a passage from Google's link spam guidelines, and you can see it's spam according to their policy for you to buy or sell links for ranking purposes. You cannot exchange money. You cannot exchange any kind of goods or services. You can simply not indulge in some sort of a, backlink building activity, but the entire industry will tell you it's straight up wrong. There are agencies selling backlinks. There are massive brands buying backlinks, and we all know they work. So when Google say in their guidelines that inauthentic mentions, which by the way, according to Google, is any sort of a mention that you build manually, right, which does not occur to your company on its own completely organically, does not work. Again, it's just totally wrong. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all these guidelines in entirety are wrong. Of course, there are elements to them which I think make sense. For example, llms.txt file. There's absolutely no evidence till this point that AI search models, most of these big companies, have some sort of a, acknowledgement towards llm.txt as a, directive file. So that is universally accepted. Although some companies are still doing it, right? Many of the industry folks are still building these llm.txt files. There's no universal acceptance of this fact. Same goes for structured data, right? I agree that over-focusing on structured data might not be the best use of it. Why? Because we actually have data on this now, right? Recently, Ahrefs tracked about 1,800 pages, adding schema to them, and they noticed that AI citations barely moved. It had almost no noticeable impact, adding more structured data or schema markup for AI search optimization. But again, releasing these massive guidelines on optimizing for AI search and then calling almost everything which actually happens to have validity from an optimization standpoint a myth is just straight up wrong. And let me remind you that this is not the first time that Google is doing something like this. For years, Google has spoken against the idea of a website authority score that it gives to websites based on authority, right? The domain authority that we used to call it. But when Google's API leaks happened, right, and Rand Fishkin and Mike King spoke about it, domain authority was in fact one of those things which just came as a surprise, right? It actually happened to be an endpoint in their API leaks, and it was confirmed. Google also said previously that they don't use click data directly for search rankings, but then again, later in the API leaks, it was confirmed that they actually do. They have Nav Boost, which looks at a bunch of clicks and engagement metrics and then determines rankings based on that. They did the same thing when someone explicitly asked, does Google use Chrome data to determine rankings? And they said, no, we don't think we do anything with it, which again was one of those things that got debunked in API leaks from Google. Now, with all that context in mind, when Google says it's just SEO, you don't need to think about anything more than what you're used to, I wouldn't buy that, right? It simply does not make sense. It's not consistent with what they have been doing for years. So again, coming back to this article, there is a lot of good stuff in here. I'm not saying this is all bullshit, but there are elements of bullshit to it, which I think you should not entertain. So this is it. If you ask me, I would totally admit that there are huge overlaps between AI search optimization and traditional SEO optimization. But there are also unique elements that only apply to AI search, which don't typically apply in the same way to traditional search. If you really want to win with AI search optimization, I highly recommend paying attention to some of these actual practitioners in the space and then going out and doing stuff for yourself, test out what works. Sure, still pay attention to what Google says, but use it directionally and be a skeptic. It's to your own benefit.